Hello and welcome to Everybody Podcast. I'm Daria Matza. Today I welcome Laura Fraser to the show. She is a journalist and author of many books, including Losing It, which is about America's obsession with weight and the industry that feeds on it. She actually goes undercover for this book as an investigative journalism piece to really delve into the insidious nature of the dieting world. But another part of Laura's story is that last year, her sister Jan died of cancer, a cancer that might have been diagnosed sooner if her doctors could have seen beyond her weight. This is a story that is happening all too often in our society. We started with talking about her book and the inspiration for it. Let's delve in.
Like so many people, I was put on a diet when I was little. I was told I was overweight from a very young age. And I had three older sisters, two of whom were also overweight. And I use the word overweight because that was the word that was used at the time. I developed an eating disorder. Mm-hmm. It just was such a big theme in my life. I felt like weight was just like the background music always. And so as a journalist, I started doing research about the diet industry and just ended up feeling quite convinced that a lot of the so-called research that was saying that being heavy was a much higher risk for mortality was really being done by obesity researchers who were biased because they were being paid by the pharmaceutical companies. That was one big thing that I discovered. Mm-hmm. The other was that there was research that showed that if you took exercise into account, then weight was a red herring when it came to studies on weight and mortality, which had usually been done just with weight and not taking exercise into account.
Right, that's like Catherine Fliegel's work, right? Is that what you're talking about?
This was originally done by Stephen Blair.
Oh, yeah. I know his name too.
And this is 20 years old. And then the third thing was that it was right around the time when people were trying to get dexfenfluramine passed by the FDA.
Is that fen-phen?
That became fen-phen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, I looked at all of the European studies, which showed that, in fact, if a lot of people on fen-phen developed some sort of it was like a heart-lung disease, the name of which escapes me right now. But, I
remember hearing people were getting like holes in their hearts or something horrific.
There were problems that had been reported in the literature in Europe, and it was very clear that if you bring that combination of drugs to the United States with a much bigger market, then a lot of people will die. So on a journalistic level, there was a lot that I wanted to write about and report on. And then from a personal level, I just had this kind of anger inside me that I had wasted so much of my life worrying about my weight and feeling bad about my weight, and that I had wasted so much of my life having an eating disorder, which in many ways was much more damaging to my health than just being 175 pounds at 5'6". I mean, I was never obese, and I mean, I've had people criticize me saying, how can you write about weight? You're not that fat. And my response to that is that, well, first of all, it was my experience. And I certainly felt teased and degraded because of my weight. But also, it's just a barometer of how serious fat discrimination is in this culture, where someone like me who grew up just, a bit round, a bit heavier than most kids was, not only teased, not only put on diets, but sent to a psychologist who hypnotized me and told me disgusting stories about food so that I wouldn't eat them. It was aversion therapy.
I also read, which I think is worth saying in this moment, that your father was a pediatrician, right?
Right. And so I think it's important to put things into context. My parents, both athletic, my father, a pediatrician, thought that being overweight was unhealthy. And so they tried to do what they could to get us to lose weight. There wasn't a lot of better wisdom out there. But it really turned out that their comments about weight, they're putting us on diets, are basically all the things that are guaranteed to make your kids heavier and go exactly in the opposite of the current recommendations given by, say, the American Academy of pediatrics. And then I think on a personal level, the fact that my father was a pediatrician made him feel, and my mother feel, embarrassed that we were heavy. And one of the things that studies about doctors with heavy patients has shown is that they feel a sense of failure. It's like they feel like they can't help their patients. And that's something that really affects them. And I think that it was extremely frustrating for my parents to have 3 of their 4 girls, just keep getting fatter. They kind of did what they could. They thought sending me to a psychologist was a good idea. And it might have been, had it been the right psychologist and not a sadist who practiced aversion therapy.
Wow. So what was your path to recovery once you realized you had an eating disorder?
It took a long time. I discovered dance and had never felt athletic in my life. I always felt like a brain on top of an undifferentiated mass and was really quite alienated from my body, because you get that message as a kid when you're heavy that you're no good at athletics, you're slow, you're uncoordinated. And I started taking dance class in college and found that, in fact, I wasn't uncoordinated. In fact, I was a good dancer. I think that movement, positive movement, is really helpful for people of any size. And it's something so many fat women are discouraged from. And it's just so important that people develop a positive relationship with their body. So I started to dance. Another thing that helped me when I was bulimic, I lost a lot of weight, which was very freaky and scary. And, it was a long process of stopping the behavior of purging, because it's not just about purging to lose weight. It becomes an addiction. Bulimia is it's like psychologically addictive. It's physically addictive. It's just really hard to break that habit. And what really helped me was leaving the country, which just shows how culturally determined so many of our eating problems are. After college, I went to the Mediterranean. First of all, I didn't have the money or the resources or often the toilets to keep binging and purging all the time. I mean, if you're on one of those squat toilets in Egypt, you think twice.
Right.
And second of all, I was away from the pressures that had been contributing to me being bulimic, both the pressure to be perfect, and no one was telling me that my body was wrong anymore. And I think it was weird when I got back to the States and I had stopped vomiting, I started gaining weight. I got all these messages from people like, oh, it's such a shame you're gaining weight. You were so pretty when you were thin. It was just like the same thing over again.
Did you also have the experience, I've had this experience when going abroad too, where culturally there's just the acceptance and the appreciation of pleasure in food in a different way?
Totally, yeah. It was so eye-opening because I, was able to really sit down and enjoy meals as they do in Italy. Nobody eats between meals. You sit down. It's a social thing. You enjoy it.
Right.
And when you have a real feeling of satisfaction when you eat a meal as an event socially, you feel satisfied. And it's a satisfaction that, takes you through. When you're constantly dieting, your eating is chaotic. You never feel satisfied. You continually want to eat something else.
Yes, absolutely.
Coming back to the United States, it took me seeing a psychologist for another few years to really finally get over that behavior. I mean, it was sort of something that I always kind of had in my back pocket. Now I'm in my 50s and I can see the toll that it's taken, for example, on my teeth.
Well, do you feel like writing Losing It was is a bit of an activism or a reaction to that experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I wrote that book to just, I just wanted to drive a tank through the diet industry. I mean, it's the only industry that's built on failure. And I'm not saying that no one can ever lose weight, but the model of having starvation diets and deprivation and making you feel bad if you're the one who can't stick to it, that's just, medieval.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just a recipe for feeling terrible about yourself.
Yeah, it's disgusting. One thing I was so curious to talk to you about was that you went undercover to explore some of these snake oil salespeople in the dieting industry. And what was that like, having been in eating disorder recovery, to kind of re-immerse yourself, even though it was falsely so, in this world?
When I did it, it was a good 10 or 15 years after I had gotten over having an eating disorder. So I didn't feel like it was going to trigger anything for me.
Your recovery was solid, yeah.
Yeah, but it was interesting. At the time, I was overweight, by social standards, but not medically overweight. But it was not medically overweight. There's nothing in the literature, which is already skewed, to say that someone with a BMI of 27 should be put on diet pills.
Right.
I mean, and that was actually one of the big issues in my book. Was there was a study that came out of Harvard, a researcher named Joanne Manson, who kind of made headlines saying that if you're 10 pounds overweight, you're at an increased risk of mortality. So I looked at her study and I looked at, well, what would that be? Like a BMI of she was talking about a BMI of between 25 and 27, or maybe up to 30. I can't remember. I looked at her study, and there's something in scientific studies called p-value, which shows whether or not the number you're seeing has any significance or not. And so in her study, the actual p-value reached statistical significance only at a BMI of about 31 or so. So I called her on that, and I said, below BMI 31, you cannot say that there's an increased risk of mortality. And she said it's trending in that direction. And so then, I did some research and found that she was being paid by the pharmaceutical company that makes dexfenfluramine. And why? Because the huge market of people who were between the BMI of whatever it was, 27 and 30, could then be sold diet pills, these diet pills that ended up killing all these people.
Right.
So I was on a tear, really.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. It's like true passion. True-blooded passion, yeah.
Not that much has changed.
It's good. I'm sure it's even more so.
Some has changed.
Yeah.
Some has changed.
Well, so when you were going undercover, you were kind of saying you wanted to go on these diets, saying you wanted these diet pills.
Yeah, they were all happy to give me pills,
right,
even though I did not meet the medical definition of overweight. But they were just like, sure, take these. I mean, one place, we just got handfuls of pills. And
they were like, give me your money and here are your pills.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure right now I could do the same thing and walk in and ask for gastric bypass. And they'd look at me and go, sure, we can do that.
Right.
I have a friend who was like, I don't know, maybe she was 210, 220 pounds and had a gastric bypass. I'm like, really? You're going to take that risk?
Right. Yeah.
At that weight? She wanted to be skinny because she told me that you need it to be, in the media, and she really wanted to be a public figure. How
did that work out for her?
She was emaciated at first. She slowly gained back some of her weight. I think it's hard to say. I know she said that she felt like she had less energy. I don't know. She went off on a different spiritual trip. It's hard to say. I'm not really friends with her.
Yeah.
But I personally felt like she lost a lot of her energy and her fun. And she was beautiful.
Yeah.
And then just turned into this skeleton.
When you were doing the book, what was most surprising?
I think the most surprising were the way that so many mainstream obesity researchers were being paid by pharmaceutical companies or by the big diet companies to massage their data.
Yeah.
They were trying to convince people that even being slightly over a BMI of 25 is dangerous for your health in order, to say, okay, then we can sell them all these diet products. The fact is, when you take exercise into account, it's really hard to find a weight that's dangerous for your health. I mean, yes, increased weight can affect certain diseases. Being very heavy can cause certain risks to some people. Being BMI 27 to 30 doesn't. But beyond that, if you are fatter than that and you're eating healthfully and you're exercising, well, guess what? That's the weight you are. And so let's deal with that and how you can be healthy in the body you're in instead of constantly imagining that you too can be 135 pounds if you were just vigilant enough.
No one talks about either, which I know you did in your book, about the health risks associated with being underweight.
Yeah, a lot of mortality studies, and I'm rusty on these, show that you're healthiest if you have a little bit of fat when you're older, which makes sense because if you have some kind of a disease where it's hard for you to eat, you've got some reserves.
Right. Yeah.
And then smoking, of course, controls everything.
Right.
Everybody says that everybody's so obese right now, in the culture. But part of it is when you stop smoking, you gain weight. Mm-hmm. And so Americans are fatter now than they used to be, but they're not smoking. And guess what? Rates of heart disease and so forth have not gone up.
Right. I wondered if you made this connection in your book about, and I've been thinking about this with what you're just saying, that when the dieting industry really took force was probably when TV started, I'm guessing, and women's magazines. If that's when the whole weights of Americans started increasing, because as we know, yo-yo dieting only makes you fatter. So I wonder if there's a connection to be made there, that like the dieting culture, the diets actually created the, I'm quoting here, air quoting, obesity epidemic.
I think that diets have definitely contribute to people being fat. I mean, if your eating is chaotic, if you learn from a young age to ignore your signals of hunger and satiety in favor of external controls, then you're not going to be a healthy eater.
Right.
And that's apt to make you fat. And there's some research, and again, I'm not up on it, but there has been some research in the past that yo-yo dieting, messes with your metabolism and so forth.
Right.
As for when the whole, fat prejudice started in the United States, I do think it had to do with the rise of advertising. It's also very much a class and somewhat race issue in the United States because, basically until the turn of the century, until industrialism, until transportation, refrigeration, a lot of people in this country, unless you were wealthy, just didn't have enough to eat and they worked very hard. And so being fat was not really a condition for a lot of people. Wealthy people liked to be plump as a way of showing that, they had plenty to eat and they didn't have to work. And so that sort of became flipped a bit when all those things, refrigeration, et cetera, made it possible for poorer people to gain weight. Then suddenly it wasn't so chic for the rich people to be fat. It's like the star-bellied sneetches. And then at the same time, there were a lot of immigrants that came into the United States. And a lot of, I think a lot of Northern European people wanted to distinguish themselves from sort of shorter, rounder, darker people by being thin. It's this very European kind of an ideal.
Right.
So much so that, in fact, when I was little, my parents took me to a doctor because they thought my back was deformed because I had a big butt. It's like hyperlordosis, but it was sort of like, that must be a disease,
Wow. Yeah.
All of those factors contributed. And then the rise of women's magazines and the consumer culture created mass media images that became standardized and also fantasized. So the Gibson girl, which was a cartoon character, not a real person, with a tiny little waist, kind of the Barbie of her time, became a very widely disseminated image, and women started to want to have a body sort of like that. And then the flappers came along, and they wanted to be sort of quote unquote liberated from hourglass body of their mothers, the Victorians, who seemed to represent constrained both literally with corsets and in their roles as mothers and housewives and objects of consumption in the upper classes. Right. And so the flapper body was thin and androgynous and represented freedom to those women because it was essentially a masculine body. And so even though the impulse towards that thin figure was feminist in a sense, it was also at the same time very anti-female. And you see that happening again in the 60s after the kind of domestic wasp-waisted figures, maternal figures of the 1950s. In the 60s, liberation was once again associated with a slender body. And then again in the 70s, women start going into the workplace. They wear big shoulder pads and the look is thin in order to pass in the male world.
Fascinating. That's like connecting all the dots that I kind of knew, but stringing it along there is really fascinating.
Thank you.
Do you see much has changed?
Well, I think certain things have changed for the good and for the bad. I think that our, media images of women are pretty much as limited as they always have been. You open a women's magazine, everyone's thin, thin, thin. There are, though, more pockets of the culture that are pushing back. And the fact that where we get our media has become so broad that we have a lot of other sources for imagery, which I think can be positive. There are a lot of fat positive people out there who are writing, who are blogging about fashion, who are on Instagram. And I think that there are pockets of the culture that are picking that up. So you do see more fat acceptance among young women, I think, than you used to. I see almost more with diets now. So much of it is couched in this like healthy, clean eating.
Yeah, I was actually had that on my list to talk to you about because I just read the article in New York Times Magazine that Taffy. Did you read that article? Yeah. And how she was talking about Weight Watchers' shift from dieting to wellness. And I noticed you were talking about that 20 years ago with the bariatric conference you went to. And they were pushing using the term wellness.
What happened when I wrote my book, we were right in the middle of this fat is bad phase. And so everyone was like, oh, I can eat all the carbs I want. But then you get into the extremes of the sort of orthorexia, the kind of like Gwyneth Paltrow cleanse bullshit. And that's just another type of eating disorder.
Right.
All the people who are like, oh, I'm gluten-free and they don't have celiac disease, it's just fashionable. That to me is just a way of imposing your individual specialness on everybody around you, proving that you're sort of being good in some way. I don't know. I have very little tolerance for it. I recently got married. We had a reception at an Italian wine bar, and there was like all this great food. I went up to a couple, and the woman, without saying congratulations, says, I'm gluten-free. I don't think there's anything here for me to eat.
Oh my gosh. Why did you invite her to your wedding?
I invited her husband.
Okay.
And so I just looked at her and I said, that's your problem.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Meantime, there was an array of meats and cheeses and olives and almonds and, it was just like, and that proved the point to me that these people just have to like make themselves special. I'm like, you're kidding me. This is my wedding reception.
Yeah. Wow. That's very disappointing.
Yeah, it was
interesting.
Really
that's super annoying. Congratulations on getting married.
Oh, thank you.
Do you think, so, I mean, in some ways I feel like people are starting to catch on to this whole wellness marketing and clean eating. Do you have any sense of what could be coming next?
Oh, God only knows.
Bracing ourselves for.
I worry that way too many people are getting obesity surgery, and that's gonna come back, and people are gonna have really difficult times. We don't know what happens to people as they get older who've had those kinds of surgeries. We'll see. Hopefully, it's not going to be awful, but I know that, in the past, a lot of people have had problems getting sufficient nutrition, for example, because they can't absorb all of the fat-soluble vitamins that they need. So they have to get shots.
And a lot of what we see from those surgeries, I think, is people giving us research like 2-3 years out, when really it's 10 years out that seems like the effects of that micronutrition would really affect you.
Yeah, 20 years out.
Yeah.
Everybody, people have these genetic predispositions to disease, and it's really hard to know what causes those genes to mutate or activate. And we just don't know. I'm not going to say no one should ever do it. There are people who feel like they're living much happier lives. So, okay. But I fear that weight loss surgery is going to become like cosmetic surgery, where it's just kind of expected at a certain point.
Right. Yeah, I could see that too. One thing I wanted to talk to you about, which I feel like you've somehow captured, and maybe it's from traveling, is really finding that pleasure in food again, which I feel like is such a piece of this puzzle that is lost in a way that people can't really comprehend until they get it back.
We grow up feeling like food is bad or it's good. If we eat bad food, we're bad. And it's such a pleasure and a freedom to be in a culture where it's okay to eat. And part of what makes it possible in those cultures is that there are pretty prescribed rules about how you eat. If you're in France or Italy, you don't walk around with a Coke and a croissant in your hand.
I haven't been there in a while, but when I was there, you don't carry a Starbucks cup around. When you have a coffee, you sat down.
Exactly. You're not going to have the issues with food that you have if you're chaotically trying to diet and then feeling deprived and then sneaking food and then beating yourself up about that and then thinking, I'll go on a diet tomorrow, so I'm going to pig out today. All of that is very chaotic behavior.
Yeah, well, I'm going to do a plug for your article, Food for the Heart. I know I'm sounding a little bit like I spent the last 24 hours just reading your work, which I did. But I really loved that piece, and I was thinking about, Remembrance of Things Past, Marcel Proust.
Yeah.
Thinking about, for those who don't know that are listening, he's biting into this cookie, this Madeleine, and he's flooded with these memories of his childhood and his life. And it made me think about, you were talking about these connections with food in that article in a similar way, and how much we're blocking and losing when the mind is in that mantra of this cookie's fattening, I shouldn't eat carbs, tomorrow I'm going to diet. And those experiences of food really can connect us to history and our emotions, and it can time travel you and ground you if you can experience it in that way.
Yeah. A woman named Ellen Satter, who's an expert on childhood eating, once said, if you use food to comfort you, let it comfort you.
Mm-hmm.
Which I thought was just very wise, because sometimes we're upset and we just want to eat and then we feel bad about it. It's like, no, actually, if you're upset and a piece of toast or whatever is going to make you feel better, let it make you feel better. And it then can stop that impulse to just keep binging.
Yes. I have here in my notes that line you wrote, the oysters were so fresh, they tasted like my tears.
Yeah.
So great.
Yeah.
So great. Well, do you mind now if we transition a bit to talk about your recent article and what happened to your sister, Jan?
Sure.
She passed how long ago now?
Christmas Eve.
Oh, so not even a year. Wow.
Right.
So sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah. For those who didn't read the article, I'll post it on the show notes, but would you mind just telling us what happened?
Sure. So the article is on a site called Stat News, which is a medical website from the Boston Globe. I posted it there because I wanted a lot of doctors to read it.
That's so great. That's so wonderful.
The basic story is that, I saw my sister maybe a year and a half ago, and, she'd lost a lot of weight. And I commented on it like we're all conditioned to do. And she said she'd lost 60 pounds. And I said, congratulations. Again, like all of us are conditioned to do. And she said, I wasn't trying. She had been in pain, had been having problems, wanting to eat. She'd been in terrible pain for a long time. And I asked her if she'd seen a doctor. She said she'd seen a gynecologist who didn't find anything. And she said she felt like he had just completely dismissed her, that she was an older fat woman, and that, whatever problems she had were because of her weight. And so she then tried all sorts of things, like not eating gluten, like all these things, trying to get to the bottom of what it was that was causing her this tremendous abdominal pain and to keep her from eating. And I was like, well, you have to get a second opinion. And she seemed very resigned, because one of the things that happens when people are fat and they're fat shamed by their doctors is that, guess what? They don't want to go to another doctor.
Right. That's like statistically happening over and over again. Did she have that experience throughout her life?
I think she rarely went to doctors.
I mean, growing up, I imagine in the description you gave earlier, you guys were often medicalized because of your size.
We were constantly told to lose weight.
Yeah.
So eventually she went to see an internist and got the physician assistant instead. And she was just in terrible, terrible pain. The physician assistant took blood. I don't believe did any kind of a manual palpitation, couldn't have, and wouldn't give her any pain relievers because she thought she was just there to try to get opioids or something. Again, just seeing this person as like a fat person with all the stereotypes that go along with that, like weak-willed, must be trying to just get opioids, right?
Yeah.
Jan went home. She was in such pain she couldn't drive herself. And then at 3:30, she got a call from the doctor who had not seen her, but got the results of her blood tests, and he told her to go immediately to the emergency room. In the emergency room, they found that her, I think, calcium levels were sky high. They put her in the ICU. They did an MRI, and the hospital's gynecological oncologist took out what he said was the largest tumor he had ever seen, the size of a volleyball. So, apparently the doctor, the physician assistant she'd seen the day before, hadn't even touched her abdomen, or just figured she's fat, we'll never find anything in there. An enormous, enormous tumor that had already involved her bladder and her other pelvic organs, and there were already spots on her lungs, which indicated that it had spread. And so, it's like she had seen that original OBGYN 4 months previously. Okay, it was a very aggressive cancer. It spread very quickly. But did it go from 0 to volleyball in 4 months? And if that first doctor had really taken a hard look at what was going on with her instead of just assuming that whatever her complaint was, it was because she was fat, maybe she would have had a chance. But by the time they caught the cancer, it was stage 4. And there was nothing to be done but to go through rounds of horrendous chemo. And she died 6 months later.
Wow. That's just so horrifying. Did you ever contact that first doctor?
I sent him the article.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. I, of course, haven't heard from him. I mean, I'm sure he's worried that he's going to be sued for malpractice, which he probably should be, but we're not. Yeah, I didn't hear from him. And I sent it to, a couple doctors she saw later on after she was diagnosed who did genetic sequencing of her tumor to see if there was any new cancer immunotherapy that could help, blah, blah, blah. But she was too far gone.
So it was an endometrial cancer?
They're not quite sure where it started.
But it's something that's usually can be caught sooner.
I don't really know. I'm not a doctor.
Okay,
I think it's hard because it's in the lining of the uterus, which maybe doesn't show up. But if you take someone seriously when they say, I'm in tremendous pain, I've lost all this weight, by the way, I'm postmenopausal and I have vaginal bleeding. Right. Those are all very serious symptoms.
Yeah.
He just sort of like, went on her way and there's symptoms of cancer, and the very least that OBGYN should have done is sent her to a gynecological oncologist.
Absolutely. The other thing you talk about is how people kept complimenting her about her weight loss when she was dying, essentially.
Yeah. And the really sad thing was we went shopping and, she sort of had this weird pleasure for the first time fitting into sort of quote unquote normal sizes,
Yeah.
But yeah, people, at work, people in her life, and unfortunately even my father were just like, oh, wow, you've really lost weight. You look great. She didn't look great. She looked sick as hell.
Right.
And people just see weight.
I know. Yeah.
Here I am. I'd written a book about the diet industry, and I see her having lost 60 pounds, and my response is automatic.
Right.
When I see a woman in her 60s with a headscarf who's lost a lot of weight, people get a clue.
I know. Yeah. That's a big sign right there. Wow. And I remember you also saying something, your older sister had a visit recently to the doctor too and had a similar experience with fat shaming.
Yeah. The doctor told her to lay off the French fries and Cokes, which she's a very healthy eater. And then the next time she came for an appointment, she brought her husband who's thin and athletic. And, all of a sudden she was treated better.
Well, what do you think should change in the medical field?
It should be part of the medical curriculum to have some awareness of dealing with fat patients. Education about the fact that just because someone's fat doesn't mean that's the problem they're coming in to see you about when you go to the doctor. And by the way, some people are, eat healthfully and exercise, and this is the size they end up being.
Right.
If it complicates the 5 minutes you spend with your patients to deal with someone who's fat, well, sorry. They deserve high quality medical care, and to just sort of dismiss their complaints because they're fat, or by the way, because they're black, or by the way, because they're older, which also happens, is just bad doctoring.
Right. Just this kind of a last follow-up question about this idea of the obesity epidemic. In your book, you took down that idea, and I wondered what was the most compelling thing you came across with that maybe doctors out there it would be helpful to put on billboard signs.
Well, I mean, what created the obesity epidemic was a change in how the scientific establishment quantified obesity. So at a certain point, people called people obese if it was a BMI of 30, and then all of a sudden they switched it to a BMI of 27.
Right.
So suddenly a third of the United States is obese.
Right.
So let's keep this in perspective. What are we talking about here? That was a trick of statistics. So are people fatter now than they used to be? Of course they are. Yes. And some of that has to do with lifestyle, with spending so much time in front of computers and not outside and not getting exercise and not having access to high quality food, living in a food desert where, buying anything but cheap, crappy food is really expensive. I mean, there are so many places in the United States like that.
Right.
If they live in a stressful environment, that can also have to do with why they overeat. I mean, there's so many things to think about, but we have to stop thinking of it as a lack of discipline and willpower.
Well, is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to talk about? I
think we talked about a lot.
Yeah. We did. Thank you so much for your time, Laura. I really appreciate it. Okay, bye-bye. As always, thank you for listening to Everybody Podcast today. If you wouldn't mind, take a moment and rate the show because it brings it to more people's ears. I always love hearing from you, whether it's through email or Instagram. So please get in touch because this podcast is for everybody.